How did we human beings get into meaning of life talk anyway? Well, of course, we have the view that philosophy began with a wonder about the world, and we even sometimes think of philosophy as the way in which we pursue our wonder about the world. But recently we've looked at Freud, who said to us that, after all, if we ask about the meaning of life, it must indicate that something's wrong. Something's wrong either in our love life or in the work that we're pursuing. And meaning of life questions, rather than growing out of wonder, are symptomatic of illness. In fact, how did we human beings arise in the first place to ask these questions, whether asking them in a way that's good or out of illness? Were we meant to be? Which would suggest that perhaps we have a purpose, a destiny, perhaps a place of belonging, and that insofar as we live a life as tourists, perhaps in some odd way we're failed pilgrims, going here and there, not realizing that there's a place of true belonging where we should move toward. On the other hand, did we just happen? Then it's much more difficult. What should and can we make of ourselves if we just happened? Which, of course, is closer to the view of someone like Nietzsche and very much the view of Freud, who we are considering now. If we just happened, and then if it turns out to be the case that we can have no place of true belonging, are we doomed to work, steal moments of enjoyment, if lucky, live to retire, and then eventually die? In circumstances like this, what would wisdom look like? Well, we've seen some extreme attempts to get a kind of wisdom. We saw recently in Kierkegaard the notion that in some way that we could only understand as individuals, we would make a leap of faith to God. We have also seen in Nietzsche, who predicted that the 20th century would be a time of scientific progress, but also of savagery. We've seen in Nietzsche the idea that perhaps the only hope is for a creative life, and only few will have the capacities for that. Freud turns out to be much, much closer to Nietzsche. And we want to return now and look further at how Freud thought we came to be, we human beings. Freud's account of how civilized life came to be, and thus how we humans ourselves came to be as human beings, well, it was closely related to anthropological theories of his time. But Freud develops these theories in a very, very striking way. In primeval, let's call them pre-human times, it's Freud's view, what we now know and have come to be as human beings lived in small hordes, each under the influence and dominion of a powerful male figure. This figure Freud refers to as the primal father. And the primal father's dominion was construed as absolute and included access and exclusive access to everything. And Freud's particular spin on it, which should not surprise us, is that the primal father also had exclusive access to the females in the horde. Now, in these small hordes, and there must have been many of them if Freud has got this right, varying forms of rebellion developed. And there were rebellions among the other males in the horde. We can think of these other males as the sons. And these rebellions had different outcomes. And the optimal outcome would involve, and Freud said that's how the transition was made from our pre-human condition to our human condition. The optimal outcome involved the victory of the sons, and out of that came a division of the spoils, a kind of cooperative behavior and a sharing of power. Freud gives a terribly intriguing reinterpretation of this evolutionary process into our human civilization. His discussion of the underlying religious dimension, which is found in the midst of the story, is a story of the emergence of humankind. Freud claims that out of the confused, complex, overlapping emotions of fear, love, and anger, as the sons band together to attack this tyrannical father who claims everything for himself, out of that mix of emotions, this primal father is slain. Now, this slaying is an event that gets periodically reenacted, and it came to be seen by Freud as the originating element in much of religion. And Freud thought that his account went a very, very long way toward explaining ambivalence in human life, and especially toward authority. Let us dwell on this for a moment, because this is of exceeding importance. Freud believed, and it is in a number of places in his writings, that the sons, so to speak, were of course protected and made secure by this primal father. The problem was that the cost of the protection was that these sons were restricted in opportunities for pleasure, for any form of freedom, so that there was a positive emotion that the sons had of gratitude for the protection that they received, but also an angry sense, a very angry sense that the cost of this protection was that they were in many ways circumscribed and prevented from realizing opportunities and their full being. This is the notion of ambivalence. It's the notion that you both love, care about the primal father, the authority figure, but you are also angered by that figure, because that figure not only protects you, but also in some ways restricts you. And that actually underlies Freud's account of what we refer to as the Oedipus complex. What the Oedipus complex is about is not just a story from early Greek literature where Oedipus slays his father without quite knowing at the time it was his father, and then ends up sleeping with his mother. The Oedipus story for Freud is also a story about authority, and a story about the anger one has toward authority, and a story about a relationship one would have to a nurturing figure, and that the authority does get in the way of that relationship with the nurturing figure. And then what must be done is that the authority figure must be removed. And only after the removal of the authority figure is the close relationship of some metaphorical but nonetheless significant sort possible for poor Oedipus, or more generally for each and every one of us. Let me pause for a moment here to tell you one other aspect of this that was outrageous to some people who read Freud. Freud said that if you understand the Christian service of communion, that the Christian service of communion is, in our time, a reenacting of the slaying of the primal father. And that in the communion service, when it's talked about the bread and the wine, the body and the blood of Christ, that is a reenactment and a more clear theological way of these primitive feelings that human beings had at the earliest beginnings of the human race. I mentioned to you in our last time together that Freud does refer to Nietzsche, and in fact quotes Nietzsche as saying that in dreams are found some primeval relic of humanity, of our earliest beginnings. And Freud does hope to make his career out of explaining the significance of dreams and what they tell us about the lowest, most significant strata of our psyches. In Freud's interpretation of dreams, he refers to something called wishes. Sometimes he talks about them as dream thoughts, but whether he talks about them as wishes or as dream thoughts, what he means is that they are underlying primary drives. These are supposedly primal instincts that weave the fabric of what becomes and is the unconscious. And especially if these drives cannot get a normal, natural outlet, especially if they're repressed or restricted, they become more and more buried. They become more and more unconscious. In one of Freud's writings called The Future of an Illusion, Freud tells us that there are three primal, thickly disguised, and deeply hidden instincts, and he identifies them. These three instincts are incestuous, cannibalistic, and homicidal. Dwell on this for a moment. Dwell on this for a moment. Freud tells us that they are incestuous drives, cannibalistic drives, and homicidal drives. Remember what we've just been saying. Freud thinks that the sons slay the primal father. That's homicide. Freud says that the sons then share the spoils after the tyrannical primal father has been slayed. That is the women of the tribe. And Freud also says that the sons, having slain the father and supposedly then been liberated, no longer have the security of the father. And that, of course, frightens them. And what they do, in fact, is periodically reenact the slaying of the primal father. And when they do that reenactment, they usually use some kind of an animal, and they eat the animal. But the eating of the animal, though they may not know it, except in a very confused way, is eating of the primal father, ingesting, taking in part of the primal father, and that's meant to then take on some of the power of the primal father. But of course, that eating of the primal father in the ritual sacrifice, that is deeply in our tangled unconscious. Cannibalism. Well, is that what is really going on? Is that the teeming cauldron? Is that the kind of subterranean reality out of which human life has come? Has Freud got this right? What would questions about the meaning of life look like if that's the picture we're really going to accept? Well, Freud, in the interpretation of dreams, not only talks about these wishes, these drives, these desires that underlie all of our actions as we arise into full humanity, he also talks about a censorship mechanism. And he says that a censorship mechanism is woven into the very fabric of our psyche. And this censorship mechanism, of which we're also not altogether aware, prevents these primal drives and wishes from reaching our human consciousness. If you think about it for a moment, it would be quite a terrifying thing to look deep within yourself and discover that you are at your lowest stratum homicidal, cannibalistic, and incestuous. Freud claims that the censorship mechanism that operates, in fact, shields us and protects us from a knowledge about ourselves which, if we fully had it, would in fact be at best uncomfortable. What Freud tells us is that this censorship mechanism prevents us from experiencing directly our most basic instincts. But he tells us that nonetheless, these instincts exert enormous pressure to get released, to get expressed, to get acted upon. They are relentlessly trying to reach the surface of our consciousness, and there is a protective mechanism, a censorship mechanism, that keeps them from arriving fully into consciousness, tries to keep them from arriving into consciousness at all. And if you think about this for a moment, the picture it gives you is a teeming cauldron of primal urges and a strong and severe mechanism that tries to keep these urges ever from entering into consciousness. And then what we have above that battle is our consciousness, our so-called normal life, our cultural, personal activity. Now, Freud develops the notion of the dream work, not the dream, but something he calls the dream work, whereby underlying primal wishes find ways to circumvent the censorship mechanism and find their way into the actual content of our dreams, though in very disguised ways. In a few minutes, I'll talk to you about the interpretation of dreams. But right now, what we need to look at is something Freud calls the dream work, the way somehow these primal urges get past the censorship mechanism and in some kind of disguised way emerge into our consciousness. And the dream work involves for Freud 4 fundamental mechanisms. One he calls condensation. What we should all do, I think, to make this work best is consider some of our dreams. Do you ever have a dream in which some image appears that seems scrambled, seems many different items fused together, and it's a mystery to you? If Freud's right, that is the work that the dream work does, which Freud calls condensation. It fuses many elements into one image at one location. And in the dream then, where that image appears, some of the urges have been given an outlet, but in such a fused and confused way that we don't quite know what it means. But yet the dream has been the place where a little bit of that underlying pressure has been relieved. The second of the 4 tactics that Freud claims the dream work uses is one called displacement of psychical intensities. What that is the circumstance in which something very incidental in your dream, some marginal element in your dream, comes to carry the important underlying but hidden content. Let me give you an illustration of that, because Freud thinks our waking life also is much like our dream life. And if Freud's right and psychoanalysis is right, very often when you talk to people, if they say, oh, by the way, I should also mention it's not of any importance, typically that will be the element in the conversation that's the important one. Or if someone says, oh, before I leave, there's always this notion that the last thing you say might be the most important. I just thought I'd also mention it's not of any importance. Well, that for Freud is a very, very useful mechanism of the dream work. It displaces psychological intensities. A third element is referred to by Freud as considerations of representability. This is the third element in the dream work, and it's more popularly known as symbolism. Let me give a brief mention of a few symbols. You can come up with more than I. A house is supposed to be a symbol of the womb. In fact, in the 1950s, as I remember, very often spoofing and many examples were given of various things that were supposed to be Freudian symbols. And I won't go very much further into that, other than to say over the holidays, well, candles represented one half of the human race, and wreaths were supposed to represent the other half. And many comedians made a great deal of that. But Freud had a long kind of account, almost a kind of architecture of various kinds of symbols and how they worked. The fourth element of the dream work for Freud had to do with how we revise. We tell revisionist stories about things that come up in our dreams. What he really calls that is secondary revision. You know how in a dream can go bad on you? And as the dream's going bad, you try to change it. You even say in the dream, this must be a dream, and you try to work it in another direction. Well, Freud says that's the fourth element in the dream work. Now, the dream, not the dream work that built it up, but the dream as we know it, is the result of the intensity of primal desires, the strength of the censorship mechanism that would hold them back, and the cleverness of the dream work that gets these primal urges into our dream and perhaps in disguised, unusual ways into our lives. And the work of the dream work is a work of reversing this process. We interpret means knowing what the dream work is like. We use that knowledge as aid and as clue to working ourselves back to what the primal urge must have been and having some experience of it. I say having some experience of it because we've already found out it's incest, cannibalism, homicide, but we have to have some experience in ourselves of that to release the underlying pressure, to moderate the tensions that have grown out of instinct frustration. We have to have some way to make that happen. Well, let's continue along and see where Freud takes us. Let's see where we go from this situation of interpretation. Freud, along with Shakespeare, will believe that the whole world in a certain way is a dream. We don't just have to look at our dreams to find out our underlying urges. We can also find out our underlying urges in waking life, because in waking life there are slips of the tongue, there are all kinds of phenomena that are part of our waking life that are very much like displacements, condensations, symbolic elements in our lives, in ways in which, for example, if you have a traumatic experience, remember in the dream, Freud talks about secondary revision, meaning we try to rework the dream even while being in the dream because it's getting uncomfortable. Freud thinks that in our waking life, after a traumatic circumstances happen to us, we often rework it. We tell our friend what happened. The next day we tell other people what happened. And by the time a week has passed, we've revised the story of what's happened to make it more comfortable for us. Let's turn to transference, another important element in Freud's account of our nature. Freud has a very strong central notion of transference as part of our human life. It remains to a considerable extent unaccounted for in philosophical theories of our knowledge of each other, and Freud, in fact, discovered it almost accidentally. Let me pause and tell you how that happened. He did discover it accidentally, and I'll give you a little more about that. Freud was humble about himself, and he found that as he was quiet and listened to patients, they would get enraged with him, or they would fall in love with him. And he thought, it couldn't be me, Sigmund Freud. I'm listening to these people, and they're getting enraged with me. They're coming to adore me. What it must be is that deep feelings they have to someone else, probably someone from their distant past when they were very young and vulnerable, probably those feelings toward those people are getting transferred over on me, Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud's understanding of transference was that often we are not the objects of other people's feelings, we are the occasions for those feelings. And the people that vent their feelings on us don't realize that this is what's happened. Why did Freud use a couch? He used a couch because of a curious kind of personal reticence he had. His own account is that he couldn't stand looking in people's faces all day. So he came up with the idea that probably what would have to happen is that people might lie down, then he wouldn't have to look at them. Now, of course, the psychoanalytic couch has become a kind of part of our culture. For Freud, it was the most convenient way not to look in people's faces. I mentioned in the earlier lecture free association, that Freud would ask people to say anything that came into their minds. How did that happen? Freud had a woman patient say to him one day, if you'll just be quiet and listen, I'll get to something worth hearing, if you'll just be quiet. That was free association. Again, once more, how did Freud discover transference? People were getting angry at him. They were adoring him, falling in love with him, and he was sitting there listening to them. And he was thinking to himself, but I'm just Sigmund Freud. These feelings can't be about me. I might be their occasion, but I can't be the real object of these feelings. Freud's discovery of transference was not just a discovery of something that happened with sick people, people who were emotionally ill that needed some form of treatment. Transference for Freud was said to pervade human life, to be largely unrecognized, and to keep people from experiencing each other without distortion. Transference is said to result in part from crucial and crucially unresolved situations from our past. And a famous story often told is the following, that once Freud was asked, what do you make of a situation where two people are with each other but aren't really relating to each other and have no sense of who the other is and are playing out on each other dramas from their own past that they don't even remember and don't even understand? And Freud paused for a moment and said, oh, I just call that normal, ordinary human life. That's what happens all the time. Oddly, this has a curious kind of resemblance to a Hindu doctrine of karma. Karma in this sense, that could it be the case that we are playing out in our lives, repeating a drama that has occurred before many times, many times, many times? Am I, for instance, reliving problems I had, hopefully don't any longer have, with my mother, and all the things I do now, every day, and in every way? And if the Hindus are right, of course, we're playing out dramas that were unresolved, not just from early in this life, but from earlier lives. So the notion of transference and the notion of karma are somewhat connected. What is suggested in this, and it is part of a basic notion in Freud, is that the problem of the meaning of life is really a problem about discovering what the present is really like. Part of the problem of the meaning of life, in short, is first to discover the illusions that one lives by, and then find ways to escape them. Let me put this in another way. Is it possible that the hardest place to live is in the present? That we spend so much of our lives living in terms of hopes or fears about the future, or equally we spend an extraordinary amount of our time living in regret, remorse, revisionistic redescription of the past, and therefore we find it very, very difficult to live in the present. A famous philosopher once said that if you construed eternity not as time that never ended, but that if you construed eternity as timelessness, that is, eternity would be escaping time altogether, then you'd live eternally to the extent you could live in the present. And part of what Freud tries to do through the analysis of dreams, through working with patients as they talk about conflicts in their lives, is to try to help them to strip away illusions, various fears, even many hopes, in order to live as fully as possible in the present. But this is an odd sense of the meaning of life. And take note of how far we've come to reach this notion of the meaning of life. Because living in the present, if you could fully do it, on the axial model that we've been looking at as we've woven our way through our time together, looking at the present in the axial model is to find, if you could be totally and wholeheartedly in it, a ladder to a place of true belonging in some kind of beyond. For Freud, to live fully in the present is something quite different. It is simply to have overcome illusions, to look at the world in which one finds oneself soberly, and to make as best one can shrewd compromises with that world in which one finds oneself. Well, let's turn now in our next lecture to some of the things that happen after Freud in the psychoanalytic tradition.